he has written a lot about foreign policy also.
Right.
And he has, I think, classified countries over friend, enemy, neutral, friends, enemy,
Right.
enemies, friend. So in that context, how would you view, our foreign policy, and if you were to give some examples
Right.
of how that Mandala system would work?
Right.
So if you can expand on that.
Sure. This brings me to the next subject. I mean, what I've just covered is one small component of the Arthashastra. Arthashastra is about 6,000, 7,000 verses. So foreign policy is a big component. The six-fold policy which I spoke about is something that where Kautilya basically categorizes on the set of neighbors that you have. Like you mentioned, it can be enemy, it can be enemy slash, friend or a neutral neighbor. So he had wanted to characterize these countries who are near you and then articulate a foreign policy based on that. So there's a lot of depth which is available on that. But what I feel is that where I think it applies to us is how do you deal with, say, a hostile neighborhood like ours, and what are some of the strategies that you can use? So he mentions about he goes from how to use, say, aggression as a tool, peace as a tool. Even talks about how you can use different say diplomatic initiatives to go and articulate with these countries. So I can probably get back to you on the details, but you're right. The Mandala philosophy, the Raj Mandala basically, it covers a lot of the foreign policy space that you're talking about. I'm not sure how contextual it is today's times, but from whatever I've read, it mentions quite a bit, and it seems relevant to what we are doing today.
Sure. You said about definition of dharma. Dharma has been very clearly defined in Manusmriti. I was just searching in my mobile phone, I couldn't locate it, but it's very clearly defined, and there's absolutely no ambiguity about it. Secondly, pricing and taxation has also been very clearly defined in Manusmriti. So do you find any conflict with the Kautilya Arthashastra?
No, what happens is there are again multiple theories here. I'll try to tell you the theories, and then probably you can take a call. One theory is the Arthashastra is far ahead of its time, as in it's far before Kautilya's time. It's just that Kautilya discovered it as a text. So that is one theory. Another theory is Kautilya sat and then compiled a list of sources from the Manusmriti, the Dharma Shastra, the Niti Shastra, and then combined it together and articulated it as the Arthashastra. But if you're really asking, definitely there are references there, and there are also some conflicts. I can probably go back and tell you what the conflicts are, but there are some areas where the Arthashastra, in terms of, say, values, in terms of accurate values, it differs from.
Ratios also.
Correct, it differs. And compared to the Manusmriti, I mean, I think the Arthashastra is very well focused on governance. I mean, from a political angle, so he does not get into religion at all, more or less.
So in modern economics, we primarily classify the government economics into two parts, right? Fiscal and monetary. So whatever you have told till now, that's primarily about the fiscal part, right? So do you find any evidence of this kind of evolution of the economics in terms of monetary policy related to Arthashastra, or even some other sources related to Arthashastra, or even any other field in the Indian tradition?
Right. In fact, that's what I'm researching now, because obviously most of it is in the fiscal side, but there are some references. For example, the trade in charge that I mentioned. So he basically mentions that the Superintendent of Trade fixes prices. Like, how do you fix a price? You need to have some amount of data on demand and supply, and then you probably need to have a team, 3-4 people sitting and assessing, giving you some inputs. So I'm still, exploring and seeing if there is any text which gives some layer to it, because so what happens is, in these type of texts, you have an open-ended base like this, okay, like a concept, and then you think about that concept. For you to derive this, he must have done something else, is what your next line of thinking goes, and then you dig further and see whether somewhere in the text there is mention of this. So that's how you kind of progress. But you're right. I'm still looking for references, but there are books which which for example, even say the demand and supply and things like that. There are some books which extrapolate his thoughts and have said, that he has not mentioned it as a framework, but the way he's executed things seems to reflect that framework. But yeah, I haven't seen like hardcore evidence on that yet. I hope to.
The quantity of gold, right, in the coins. So if the gold content has increased or decreased over the time, okay, based on the prevailing political and foreign policy situation at that time. So that kind of evidences, I think, would be
Correct.
some initiation.
No, even the idea of the flexible minimum wage, right, which I spoke about, how do you get that? You need to get that based on, say, some index, say the prices have increased, so the minimum wage also has to increase. So some measurement might have been there to reference, to make this reference. So yeah, that's something, it's still, if I get to know, I'll obviously include.
I have a question. Did Kautilya also envisage penalties in case of tax defaulters, and were there any kind of a judicial setup where, if in case of excessive tax, a person could get it redressed?
Right.
Did he have that?
Yeah, there was penalties. It's called Dandan, which I have not included here. It was there. There is a detailed thing on how, in fact, among, he even mentions in some castes, I think the Brahmins would, in fact, the Brahmins, I think, would have a higher fine if they, as compared to others, because they're expected.
No, it's more or less the same even in Arthashastra.
Even the Arthashastra, he mentions that. But yeah, he does have the thing which is available. I mean, on penalties and what, if you do not follow the regulations, what are the things that you need to do?
So, when you read these things in summary form, as Kautilya has written, how do you know whether it is merely being prescriptive or is it actually descriptive? I mean, aren't we mixing the two? Second question is regarding the references to other books. Is there any reference to the Itihasas, specifically Ramayana and Mahabharata, in Arthashastra, purely from a historical viewpoint?
Right. On the first point, I agree with you, because the challenge is how do you, whether it's descriptive or prescriptive. In fact, there is a niti, there's a process. I'm not getting the name to me. Not Chanakya Niti, but both for Ayurveda and Arthashastra, there's a kind of a tool which is there, which kind of helps you to extract this framework even more. I just heard about it last week from one of my gurus. He was mentioning that to me. But yeah, one is a translation. Another, once you go through all these translations by various scholars, then you have certain areas where you want to focus on. You try to focus and then what happens, you probably sit with a Vedic pundit and then go through each text. Because even if you know basic Sanskrit, I mean, I know Sanskrit to some extent, the density of the verses is really, for you to interpret it, you probably need to get it from a scholar. And then you extrapolate and see whether it's descriptive or prescriptive in some of the cases. In some cases, it is prescriptive. In some cases, it also describes events. But on the Mahabharata and Ramayana, from whatever that I've seen, I don't think I've seen direct references yet. It's more general from whatever I've seen, but I might be wrong. I don't know.
There was a preference for imports to exports. Has he elaborated on that, Kautilya? Like, has he elaborated on which type of imports? And a related question, were there any mention of tariffs and barriers to trade, let's say?
Yeah. In fact, what he mentions, so he mentions about imports of high value goods. So gold and mining related goods from external sources, textile, whatever high value based goods, he probably preferred that. And there are mention of tariffs. In fact, there is one of the taxes that I mentioned involves that as well. So obviously, I mean, he mentions it in a Sanskrit connotation, but there is the concept that concept is there. And in terms of barriers of trade, I mean, the interpretation of barriers of trade was made because he wants to ensure that trade is very efficient. He wants to ensure trade is there across the country. That is, he's very clear. And he wants to remove all the constraints that you have. So I think that is it's a fair assumption to make that that can be construed as barriers of trade. So yeah.
So my question is, so do you think that the present day Indian welfare state or the socialist the state that is in existence, is it in consonance with the Kautilyan model of economy, or do you think there need to be some major or minor modifications like advocating for free market economy?
Right. I don't want to get into a view on the state. That's for them to deal with. But I think what has whether in terms of comparison, the welfare state, in the sense, if you look at the subsidies that we are doing today, essentially we gain revenue from, say, taxes. We mobilize revenue through taxes fundamentally, and through other sources as well. But in those days, they used to mobilize revenue and then use it. The king uses it for these measures. But the difference there probably is, I don't know whether doles were given, like free rice and freebies and things like that. In fact, I don't know whether Kautilya would be in agreement with that, because he seems to be, from whatever I've read, a fairly rigorous guy. I mean, he seems to be someone who's not going to, he probably would keep a clause within that itself. You produce this much yield, and that's when you can give me, or I'll give you subsidy. So he seems to be very, very shrewd in areas in the text. So the welfare system still existed, but the mechanism of welfarism, whether it was the same then or now, might be different purely because avenues have changed, right? Then there was just agriculture in a few other states. I mean, you had a need for food, but today you have a need for TV, you have a need for all other resources. So the variance, I mean, the output might vary, but the process of the output might be similar.
So there's a couple of questions.
Sure.
One was in timeline sense, and the other was just how relevant it is. So there's a thought that exists that says that the Arthashastra was disappeared actually from the Indian mind space for a long time, only to be rediscovered something in the 1600s, 1700s. And just since you were researching this, how did you sort of look at that? And do you also sort of connected? Do you have a sense for when he might have put it together? Because there are also debates on when Kautilya might have existed, at what point in time in history. And the other was, since you were looking at this, and specifically you made the remark that you look at it in terms of his descriptions, in terms of what he planned or what he had in his mind in that timeline. But at least from your presentation, it sounded a lot that he said was relevant today, and so therefore, how its relevance, how probably partly to do with some of the questions that you face, but how relevant is it? Should we approach the Arthashastra more from a perspective of understanding our history and where we came from, or do we look at it in terms of these are the kind of solutions it might offer to us?
Right. Yeah, so I'll address two parts. So the first part is on the chronology, right? The chronology is in fact, in my view, is a big headache, because frankly, I don't really care which time he came from. Good for all the proponents of all these things, because more often than not, what happens in the chronology debate is you end up fighting over the chronology, and then you lack essence on what the text is. So from whatever I've seen, a lot of these seem ancient. I don't think it is a 100 or 200 year kind of a thing. Even Shyama Shastri's translation is already 19th century beginning, which is authentic. And Kangle's translation, one of the other translations, is also early 19th century. So if these people have translated it, in the 19th century, and their accounts seem to be over other resources over the previous, 100 years. So I think it's fairly, old. The question really is, at what point of time in history was there? But I tend to feel it's the 3rd century BCE and beginning of CE. Seems to be, at least to my understanding, the time frame that I have kept, because that's what is more or less available. But yeah, I respect the contrarian views, but depending on evidence, I think it might change in the future, and we need to evolve based on that. On the second question, I think I would view the text as first as a kind of a something which you're happy about. I mean, I think that's the core. When I read through the Arthashastra, I began about a few years ago, I was just amazed that one of my ancestors many centuries ago was able to do or at least give an idea of these things. So once you start to engage with it as a form of rediscovering yourself, then I think everything else falls in line. If you're going to engage with it as a form of, somehow I need to apply it today, then that's going to be an issue. Because first you need to get the grasp of what the information is, and then and be honest with it. Because the problem with the application part is in the fervor of applying to current time, you make a lot of you make a lot of observations which are not necessarily objective. So once you're done with the first part, which is doing an analysis objectively from whatever evidence-based data is available, and then if you can try to look at extrapolation, I think that makes sense.
Can you draw any parallels with Machiavelli's Statecraft? That is much later. So does he take recourse to anything from that? Like the Fibonacci thing was actually taken from our system. So does Machiavelli's text have anything that you could actually link up with our Arthashastra?
Right. I am not too sure on that, but from for example, Kangley was one of the big translators. He feels that Machiavelli is completely different, Arthashastra is completely different. So some commentators feel they are not really, the base is very different on how they approach. Because I think all civilizations over a period of time will have some sort of organized structure. But the question really is, where do you use components? Like, for example, most of his focus has been on honesty and governance and more kind of a Dharmic worldview. Whether Machiavelli had that, I'm not sure. But from whatever I've read, there seems to be quite a bit of differences between the both. And only if I read through that will I be able to make the comparison.
So this Angus Maddison study, so can you tell me about what are the variables he has used for comparing these economies across the world?
Right. So what Maddison basically did is, that's quite a, there was Paul Bairoch who wrote a report in the 70s, who's Belgian-based economist. That's the popular theory, many folks would have spoken. And then they wanted to update it further. And then they went to Angus Maddison. So he spent many years, I think more than a few decades, to sit down and look at a lot of the data sets. So from what I am reading in all his essays, he compartmentalizes at various stages. Till the 17th century, where he has more data, more information, a lot more parameters are added in terms of measuring GDP and things like that. Time before, he makes some assumptions on economic activity and refers a lot of historical resources on what constitutes that activity. So what would constitute a GDP, say, in beginning of Common Era compared to, say, 1900s? There's a big difference. But he's maintained consistency in terms of the comparisons, I feel, where at every stage, all the countries that he compares and gives is very, very fair and more or less fair and consistent. So there is no emphasis on how this data set evolved. Probably, we need to explore it more. But from whatever I've read, he seems to be consistent on with historical records on what happened during these times, and he is quite clear on the fact that India and China were very prosperous during that early phase.
I have another question. Is there any notion of economic crises during that era, probably due to famines?
Yeah. So,
and how were they dealt with?
Exactly. So that's another point. So, for example, if you looked at one of the quotes which I mentioned about, there's a quote which talks about if the nation is in crisis, then the king charges additional tax to certain people. Okay. For example, he might even do it to the wealthy people. That part I'm not sure, but he charges a certain amount for people who produce more. So that variation is there, where in between, during crisis, he wants to do something else. When it's flourishing, he probably wants to redirect resources more. So that balance is there. That's one constant thing. I think the one constant thing that you can see through the Arthashastra is most of the theories are fluid depending on circumstances. So he probably has the vision to do that, not just static, which I think that's why it's not a prescription completely. A prescription is set in stone. I don't think this is set in stone. I think this kind of articulates a particular process, a particular line of thinking with variance at multiple levels. It's depending on various factors. It could be king, who's ruling. It could be like you say, some famine or some other natural resource. But there are variants available, and he seems to articulate his thinking within the variant. But he has certain foundational principles. For example, there's a mention where he says king lineage is not necessarily applicable. So, for example, if the king's son is incompetent, Kautilya says, he needs to go through the competency test. If he's not able to do that, probably you find someone else. There is a mention that the king has to have all these qualities for him to be the king. And the king is not given, another thing is he's not given complete power. In the structure, there are certain decisions which the king and his council have to take. And there's a certain kind of a percentage that the king has. So he does not have unitary power on some things. Obviously, some things the king has power, but it's not like complete slavery where you just listen to the king all the time, because he's kind of created the system. Because if that was the case, he wouldn't talk about lack of monarchy extension. He talks about why the king needs to be educated in all aspects. So he needs to go through an entire training process apparently before or when he becomes king, or whoever is coming in next has to go through the process. So again, there seems to be thought here. It's not a kind of a sycophantic behavior. It seems to be something where there is an ecosystem and a thought process is brought in, which I think is important to know.
Firstly, is there any difference between the Indic location in the chronological time and the Western one? The second, is there a debate on that? Secondly, that is the Western and the Indic. Secondly, isn't it relevant to a context? You have a context. Everything has a context. Nothing is absolute. So, isn't the chronology very important because it is located in a particular context, and the relation to others in terms of scriptures, time, civilizations, and whatever. So, isn't it actually very important?
I agree. On the first point, which Indic chronology are you talking about? Within Indic itself, there is no. So on that, I think there are differences. There are various propositions, which I leave it to the scholars to eventually come up with something which is relevant. But on your second question, I think you're right. Without the context, without the the environment around, it's very difficult for you to make robust, relatively scientific interpretations. So that context is important. But on the other hand, there are certain things like just his thought process, his ability to his ability to not concentrate power too much in one individual, for example. That's a thought process. You don't need a time frame for that. So if you look at it at a conceptual level, I think the time frame is not really relevant, because we just see how conceptually he's dealing with issues. But if you want to see how successful those concepts were, then you need a base, some sort of metric measurement to equate the success, either economic prosperity or whatever. And that involves the context. So it's a yes and no to your question, where context is relevant in some cases. In some cases, without context itself, we can make interpretations of his line of thinking in general.
Does Kautilya ever mention slave trade, which was there in most ancient societies?
That's right. I mean, he mentions about it. I mean, there is he mentions about the social structures that we have, but I don't know whether he explicitly mentions about the impact of that. Perhaps if I read more and if I'm able to make some sense out of that, But the social structures in terms of the caste system and things like that existed then. But he believed that, that again, I think he is fluid in the sense he doesn't believe that, say, for example, in a war, that you need to have only the Kshatriyas fighting. He sees some role for the others as well. And he's, I think, spins it according to the, the situation and the context. And it's similar again towards the idea of something like a minimum wage. He is flexible on that. But yeah.